Hi, I'm Catherine, and this is an analysis of one of my viewers' sparring. If you would also like to have your weapons fighting footage reviewed on this channel, feel free to DM me with a link on my Twitter. So, without further ado, let's check out the first exchange. In this exchange, you could have won. Your opponent went for your leg and you parried him. However, you were unable to riposte him because you were still recovering your weapon. This is because you lost control of your wrist, because your hips and core were not aligned with your arm. Here's what I mean. When your opponent came for your leg, you pulled it back, which turned your hips left. But at the same time, you were striking with your weapon to the right. This means that your strike is fighting against the torque of your hips, and your arm and shoulder are disconnected from your kinetic chain. This results in you losing control of your weapon because not only are you relying purely on your arm muscles, but you're also fighting the rotational momentum of your entire body. Here's what you're supposed to do.
Standard method is when the leg is attacked, we slip the leg back and come into the guard of St. George, which defends a high target zones, sets up a counter shot, and moves the leg out of the way. That's really common across so many different forms of swordsmanship. Often shown with a cut or thrust as we do it. So, Capoeira, for example, shows both the high target zones and the arm being targeted.
So the next time someone goes for your leg, pull it back and use the hip rotation from that step to just hit that shin-sniping asshole in the head. Very nice. Respond more like this against low attacks. But take a look at your attack. While this places you in a strong position, the strike itself doesn't have any power to do any significant damage to your opponent. And what's more, even if you are in a strong position to make a follow-up thrust or rising strike, you're off balance. So that's not going to be possible. You have three options. Either raise your sword higher, then strike.
Slip the leg back and come into the guard of St. George with a cut or thrust as we do it.
Or counter with a thrust instead. Raise your arm to shoulder height and line the point up with his face. Or you can stick with what you did, but improve your footwork. Footwork is one of your biggest bottlenecks and causes some of your good decisions to become bad ones. This exchange is merely one example of many of one of your bad habits. You have a very detrimental combination of bad form and a tendency to not move your feet at all. This exchange is an example of a very clean countercut that was let down by poor footwork. As you can see, you land a clean blow on his arm, but your feet remain planted rather than pulling you back out of reach. You don't need to stay in distance with the enemy if you are aiming to strike their hands. Hit and withdraw. The root of this problem lies in both your shoulders and your knees. Your knees are frequently pointed away from your opponent, meaning that every time you bend your knees to get stable, you're pushing your center of gravity backwards. This is a problem because this is inherently unstable, and whenever you change your balance by, say, trying to project force forwards, the whole structure collapses. Instead, try to point your knee forwards, towards your enemy. Your rear foot can either point 90 degrees away or 45 degrees, but I personally recommend 45. Anyway, enough with biomechanics, let's talk tactics. Your opponent's style consists of three things. 1, feints, 2, leg attacks, and 3, constant attacks. He never attacks from the guard he starts in and always feints, even when he doesn't need to. He does this because you have a tendency to chase his weapon with your own, and because he doesn't respect your pressure. And so even if it's your turn to attack, he will too. So this is how you fight that. There are 2 types of attacks, simple and compound. Simple attacks are attacks which can be made in a single tempo or a single action from your current guard or position. Notice how the fencer on the right doesn't need to wind up their attack and just immediately thrusts from guard. This is a simple single tempo attack. Compound attacks require multiple actions, multiple tempi, and multiple turns to execute. Notice how your opponent uses one turn to raise his weapon high, then another to lower it to the other side, before going for a leg strike. This is a multi-tempo compound attack. Theoretically, simple attacks counter compound attacks because they can interrupt them. In practice, however, simple attacks as counters can sometimes result in afterblows or double kills if the simple attacker isn't prepared. This is because in order to execute an effective interrupt, The interrupter needs to react during the front half of their opponent's turn. It cannot be done reactively, because by the time you see the feint, it's too late. So we need to create the conditions where we know for certain that the enemy will do a compound action. Let's look at your opponent's guard and stance. He has a right-leading stance and has his sword held low, point down. If we want to force him to use a compound attack, we need to stop him from using his simple ones. So let's see which ones he can do from that guard. He has two simple attacks, a rising cut and a thrust. Both of these simple attacks requires him to raise his weapon. So theoretically, if you place your weapon over his, any movement he makes is guaranteed to be a compound action, which means your trigger is to thrust him the moment he moves his weapon. This shortens your reaction time immensely and makes interrupting viable. So let's try to put this into practice. When he steps in, you will too, but with your right foot. We want to lead with the right because if he wants to attack your lead leg from that guard, your weapon will be in the way. Then you place your weapon somewhere over his. You don't need to make contact, it just needs to clearly be an obstacle. The moment he moves his weapon away, you lunge and thrust. He's likely going to try and hit you with a descending strike after your thrust, so be prepared to parry that after blow. But regardless of whether you hit or if he parries, you are no longer on the defensive and now have control over the fight. However, remember that no tactic or technique will work well with bad posture and footwork, so be sure to work on those. Keep it up, you're doing great. Ara.